What's up friends, Stobbie here, and welcome to episode 2 of my comprehensive guide to Battle Brothers. Now in this episode we are going to take a little look at the process of farming decent armor off of enemies, the early to mid game, and then we will look at each of the builds that I like to use and the various classes, if you will, for my brothers, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how to know which brothers to assign to which role and how the various roles synergize with each other. So let's assume you're about 30 to 40 days in, like you would be here in my campaign. This happens to be a cultist campaign of mine, and I've already acquired 1 or 2 sets of basic mail here through this process of daggering down the enemies, and 1 set of mail shirts I was even able to buy for like 200 gold. It was at 10% state of durability in one of the major cities. So that is the other big way of getting armor in the early game for cheap. If you go into the regular market area of some of the bigger cities, or randomly it can happen in some of the villages, but it's usually the big cities that have armorers, you can get damaged armor for quite cheap. Of course you got to pay to repair it, but it's a heck of a lot cheaper than it would be buying that for full price. Now assuming you can get yourself a mission like this, around about this time the groups of just thugs start turning into a mixture of thugs and raiders. This is great for us. Well, it's not great that it's in the trees, but it's great for us that there's thugs and there's raiders, because the raiders will quite likely have the armor we will want. That one doesn't have to. But the presence of thugs is doubly good for us, because it will allow us to kill the thugs first while keeping the raiders busy, and the process of murdering all the thugs should hurt the morale of the raiders, making them less dangerous. So when you're in a fight like this, you will wait till all the enemies show themselves, decide which of the enemies are the ones you're going to want to dagger down. We can say for argument's sake it's this raider. We know then that we can deal with all the rest of these guys by any means necessary. In fact, that's a better target. So anyway, you'll go ahead fighting as normal, killing all of the other enemies who you don't plan to dagger down to get their armor as quickly as you can. And then the one that you've identified whose armor you want, helpfully, the kind of armor you want tends to be heavier than the rubbish armor, and that tends to put the enemies later on in the turn order. So go right ahead and kill everybody whose armor you don't want, and just keep the one with the good armor busy. And as it transpired in this fight, we identified this raider here with his armor that it's at worn mail, and these guys just have that basic mail, or the rubbish mail that gives 90 armor. That's 110. This is the one we wanted. I've split my forces up because you know, the guys who have all the daggers are up here, and as you may or may not know, the way to almost guarantee that you get armor to not damage it, and you do that by taking a dagger, puncture, and you stab. That missed, unfortunately. But yeah, basically it's a combination of taking care of the enemies whose armor you don't want as quickly as you can and without any of your guys dying, and then just keeping the valuable guy, the one who's carrying the armor, alive as long as you can, to be able to surround him and then stab him with daggers. Remember, so this brother, for example, is getting plus 10 chance to hit with his dagger because he's got 2 brothers surrounding the target. The general tips, let's see, it can be quite useful to have a wooden stick there. Keep a high value target busy just by hitting them with the stun ability. Even if you don't have the mace specialization, hitting someone on the head with the wooden stick stuns them, and then obviously they can't output any damage for that turn. Knockout. The knockout is especially good with a wooden stick as opposed to a large mace, is because knockout does almost no damage. It does 9 to 15 to hit points, 4 to 7 damage to armor, and the less damage you do to the armor, the higher chance you have of getting it. One of these guys died, but you know, whatever. So I'm just trying to prove the point of how you should be going about for daggers to get armor. Go. Down he goes. And we are almost certain to get that armor off of that guy. I'll just cut to the end combat screen now to show you. Right, so at the end of that fight, I lost my bannerman, but whatever. Here's the point. I managed to get that worn mail shirt off of that guy who we daggered down. Interestingly, the one who we killed with the dagger, his worn mail was down at like 97% state of repair. So that means there should have been a pretty damn high chance we would get that armor. This might have been a different set of armor from one of the other raiders, but the point is, it is worth trying to dagger down the enemies that carry the armor that you want. Now, there's of course, I think I've covered this before, there is the point to be made that you suffer damage, not only in this case, in the case of a brother has died, but in terms of your other guys take damage to their armor, which costs you money as well to repair it. So it's just a calculation of whether the armor that you are gaining, how much would it cost if you bought it brand new in an armory, and how much would it cost if you take it off of the corpse of an enemy and then repair it. So as long as that calculation is in favor, it's worth it to do. It is risky, but as you get better and better at doing it, it becomes incredibly valuable. Most notably a little bit later on in the game when you start fighting brigands that have leaders in them. The leaders, of course, carry the higher tier gear, and if you have a brother who is able to wear heavy armor here, like Hugo, for example, if we come across a brigand leader that is wearing scale mail, we will clean up all of his guards that are with him. We'll just throw nets onto the leader. We'll stun him with a stick just to keep him busy. Then once everyone else is dead, we can start daggering him down and get his armor. If you can get a set of scale mail, for example, you can buy that for as much as 6,000 gold in the armory. So that saves you 6,000 gold. Please do use this technique. It's incredibly important. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the various builds that I apply to my brother. Before we start looking at all of the various builds, just if you would like access to the Word document that I have, which contains all of the perk levels, what perk you should take at what level for all of the various builds, please follow the link below in the description to my Discord, the channel called Stobbie's Builds. The little Word document is pinned there for you to have access to. Now, the first and probably my favorite build is what I call the Raider. The Raider is a ideally heavy armor wearing, but you can get away with light armor if you need to, but ideally heavy armor wearing two-handed weapon user. The real strengths of the Raider is of course AoE damage with abilities like Shatter or Sweep if you're using a great sword, or the Split Man if you're using the Great Axe, which is arguably, well, it's the highest single target damage in a single swing you can do. But in this current setup, I've gone for Warhammers to strip away armor, and then Torturers, which is the next build we'll look at in a second, to then clean up the guys once the armor is stripped away. But let's focus first on the Raider. First thing I would point out is that the Raider is very much a late game build in that he doesn't have a shield, so defense can be an issue. The Raider has to rely on his skills in reach advantage and indomitable and his armor to keep himself alive in the case of the heavy armor guy, and also in his skills and his melee defense, and arguably even dodge if you can justify going that way, but I don't, for the lighter armor guys. Like I said, strengths, big AoE damage, you can cater them for what exactly you need. For example, you can have Warhammer guys to strip away armor, then greatsword guys just to do the huge amount of base damage. Just really, there isn't much of a wrong weapon to use with Raiders. My least favorite is the big two-handed flails because their damage varies so wildly, and that is why I like the hammer so much. With a damage of 60 to 90, it's reliable damage, and the numbers of armor destruction are unparalleled to any of the weapons. 176 to 242 damage to armor in a single strike, and that is a base. It's a base two-handed hammer. If you can get yourself a named variant, you can get up to 200 to 300 armor damage per swing. Let me give you a little example of why I love the Raider so much and how it can be so good. Here's the typical reason why I split up my Raiders with a gap between each of them. It allows enemies to filter in between them like this, making these ones in these positions quite a lot easier. And two brothers swinging in an arc like that can cover quite a lot of ground. One build I do want to try eventually is just a bunch of greatsword users, 7 of them on the front line, each with a space between them, all just swinging in a big arc, covering each other and doing multiple damage, multiple hits. Now, Gangnir here already has a star in melee defense. He is wavering, lowering his stats, but don't pay attention to that right now. He has reach advantage, and he has berserk, so that he can get, hopefully, in a swing like this, multiple stacks of reach advantage. And right there, we have illustrated the one weakness to this build, is that we struggle to get through shields. But then again, how many enemy types actually have shields? And there's ways around that. But let me show you. If you against something like an Orc Warrior, you do enormous damage. And the last class I want to show you is a variant of the Raider build we just spoke about, which is the two-handed mace user. Now, this happens to be a legendary one, so slightly increased stats there. But the wonderful thing about the two-handed mace is the cudgel ability, which if you hit someone, has a 100% chance to inflict daze. Daze lowers resolve, damage, fatigue, and initiative by 30%. So if in a build like this you get a whole bunch of guys who eventually will be using these two-handed maces, you can, in theory, if all 7 of them hit a target, you can lower the damage output of your enemies by 30%. And that is especially wonderful for situations where, for example, a one-handed mace which uses knockout. You can't knock out some of the higher tier enemies. However, all enemies can be dazed. So for example, that orc warlord, which can't be stunned, you can either disarm him with a torturer, or you can daze him with a cudgel. The perks are all the same as a raider, as I just showed, but it's very, very, very effective. And the smacking sound of the cudgel is one of the most satisfying sounds in the game. Love myself a two-handed mace user. Next up, we have the torturer, which is the term I use for a cleaver specialist. I like the idea of, whipping the crap out of someone and torturing them that way, or using a cleaver to decapitate, although that's hardly torturer-ish. The torturer is a shield user normally, because I tend to make my brothers who, in the beginning when I'm hiring and firing, the lads that have stars in melee skill and melee defense will get thrown onto raider duty because they need the innate defense. Whereas guys who tend to have stars in melee skill but no stars in melee defense and need a shield to help them survive, I like to make them torturers. The strengths of the torturer and its cleaver mastery is that I think since the introduction of the battle whip, that the cleaver is arguably one of, if not the most versatile weapon in the game. You have access to the military cleaver, which has some of the highest base damage. When you are attacking an unarmored target, it is utterly devastating. And of course, the ability to decapitate is especially good against unhold with their enormous hit point pools. It's also quite good against some of the other big bad scaries like the Shrut and the Lindworm. The other nice thing, of course, is the whip allows you to attack from the second row. If this brother gets injured so badly that he can't stand on the front line, he can get rotated out and still attack the front line with his whip. Not to mention the fact that if you have a high damage, high value, danger target, you can just use disarm. So use 5 AP and 19 fatigue, range of 3 tiles, 100% chance to disarm on hit. If you're fighting, let's say for example, an orc warlord with a giant man-splitter, don't even mess with him. Just have one of your torturers disarm him, let the rest of your guys go to work, and just keep disarming that one guy. It's also quite useful if you're looking to dagger down a particular enemy or their armor, as we discussed a little bit earlier. Instead of hitting someone with a stick, you can just use the whip to disarm. The disarm also has the wonderful usefulness of when you are fighting against Hexen that are mind controlling your brothers. Let's say, if Aegis here with his 19 melee skill and 39 melee defense, even without a shield, if he gets mind controlled, that is devastating. He can almost one-shot any of the other brothers. Just use disarm, and then he's helpless for that turn, and the Hexen hasn't really done anything else. I will also point out that disarm is also good if you're fighting against a necromancer. Let's say I'm about to go into a fight here, exactly like that, a necromancer with a fallen hero. If one of those fallen heroes has any of the big two-handed weapons and he gets possessed, he can attack twice with them. That is devastating. Just disarm him, he's helpless. Now, let's show the torturer in action. So here's what I mean about the torturers being useful. We're in a fight against necromancers. This fallen hero, admittedly it's only an arming sword, but still 3 attacks with an arming sword, quite nasty. Go right ahead, disarm him. Next up we have my polearm user, although when I say polearm it's kind of a generic term just used for any guy who's going to use a long-range weapon like a bullhook, a war scythe. It could also, just by changing polearm mastery to axe mastery, you can turn this polearm user into a shield breaker whose primary job is to have shield axe mastery, a two-handed Dane axe, and then to split shields on the front line to help facilitate your guys up front for them to do damage. Lately I've moved away from using shield breakers because shield breakers are super useful in the early to mid game when your frontline guys aren't yet level 11 and higher and don't necessarily have 90 accuracy and above. But I have come to understand that my guys on the front line, I expect them to be able to hit their targets even through a shield pretty reliably. The main reason I've moved away from the shield breaker is that if you have to use one, or in most cases 2 shield breakers to break a shield on, for example, an ancient legionary, you've then used 2 of your brothers doing 0 damage. All they've done is destroyed a shield, facilitating one of the guys up front to do some damage. And if he then misses his swing, you've had 3 brothers that turn that have done nothing. Anyway, the polearm user I like very, very much. Polearm mastery is fantastic because it allows you to move 2 squares and still attack. This is doubly useful not only because you can move forward 2 squares to get into range, but it allows 2 polearm users who might be next to each other to, one of them can move in, attack, and then move away, and the other one repeats the process. You will notice that all of my guys on the back lines, even my bannerman, start with crossbows. I've started doing this because my backline guys, as you can see, also have bags and belts. I have them carry utility like bandages and iron wool potions. And just giving them a crossbow, you don't even need to spend any points in ranged skill. You're going to be picking up crossbows essentially for free after most battles. And with just the use of quick hands, which you would want anyway for switching between your armor destroying bullhook and your AoE damaged war scythe once you get them, it just means that you can fire a few shoot bolts, and if any of them hit, it's pure bonus damage really. And you'd be surprised, with even around 40 odd accuracy, you can hit, especially if you're shooting downhill, you can hit quite often. And like I said, you don't have to go put points into range skill. I tend to not use it. My polearm guys, I give them rotation and I give them melee defense, because if one of the guys up front gets into trouble, they can get rotated out by the polearm guy. The polearm user is then in a bit of trouble because he then only has melee defense that isn't that high, and he doesn't maybe have a shield on him, but really the polearm guy is just to pull one of the frontline guys out of trouble and to do huge amounts of armor damage with his bullhook and AoE damage with his war scythe. Next up we have the archer. As you can I have no doubt imagine, an archer, you are looking for a brother to have a lot of range skill, fatigue because he's going to be shooting a lot, and ideally range defense or hit points. As you can see here with Onimaru, range defense is not mandatory. I think as long as you can get a brother up to 20 range defense, the fact that he's standing behind other brothers and therefore he's being shot at indirectly, that combined with nimble means that there's very few enemy ranged fighters that will be able to give him much trouble. Of course, an enemy master archer you have to be quite careful with, but they're exceedingly rare. My archers these days, I tend to build hybrid. I like to go bow mastery for using aimed shot combining with bullseye, and wherever possible killing frenzy to ideally pick off enemy archers. But I did find that when I didn't take throwing mastery together with bow mastery, my archers would then be standing around with nothing to do if there are only armored targets to hit rather. Whereas if you have throwing axes and throwing mastery, you are doing 27 to 44 damage to armor, increased by 40% if you're attacking an enemy on the front line. Now this is even the basic throwing axes. If you are able to get your hands on some heavy throwing axes from the Vikings up in the north, those heavy throwing axes do even more damage. And I have in previous playthroughs, by just rejigging the talents that I take a little bit, if you'd have killing frenzy and executioner and you are hitting a target that is wounded with a heavy throwing axe, you can do over 100 points of damage with the javelin. It is absolutely incredible. My archers, of course, have footwork, so that if they get closed in on in melee range, they can simply move away, and they carry a dog for the similar purpose. If they get closed in on melee range, drop a dog to keep the person who's got you in melee range tied down, and you footwork away, then you can start pelting them from range. Quick hands, I find, is quite important when you are using the throwing axes. My guys have berserk, so with only 5 ammo in a bundle, you can quite easily throw 1 or 2 axes, proc berserk, throw a 3rd axe, then on the next turn throw 2 more, and then you would need quick hands to be able to, get more axes and not have your damage fall off by spending AP to flick between items. I carry bags and belts because you need lots of arrows and at least 2 bundles of throwing axes. And as I said, all of my backline guys, I like to give bags and belts for the purposes of having them cover all of my support item bases. There's iron wool potion, there's an antidote, there's bandages. All those things can be absolute lifesavers. So in this battle here, my archers have done their job taking out the necromancer, and now Volwolf, for example, is faced with a situation where if he's hitting these guys with his warbow, okay fine, these 2 fallen heroes have their armor stripped away, but I just want to demonstrate the usefulness of the throwing axes. Let's see, how much did he do there? He did, let's see, decayed reinforced mail, hit for 34 damage. Not a whole lot, but I mean, that is a heck of a lot more than it would have been if he was just using his warbow. And the accuracy, you'll note, was up to like 84%. So they're very easy to hit using throw weapon, because you get 30% chance to hit, minus 10 per tile of distance. So plus 20% chance to hit at that range. And if he had made that throw with killing frenzy and or executioner active, he would have done a lot more damage. That's just the reason why I like building my hybrid guys that way. I have for a little while been thinking about experimenting with replacing throwing mastery with axe mastery, and then if they have a target for the warbow, fine, they shoot at that. But then, like in this situation, where there's no really good warbow target, they could quick hands to the long axe and break a shield, helping to facilitate the person in front of them a little bit more. I don't think either way is right or wrong. It just depends on how you play. I prefer the throw axe rather than the break shield, because as I mentioned earlier, I like my front guys to be able to stand on their own and to be able to do damage themselves. I don't like them to be determined on someone else to facilitate, although it can be hard getting past the shields. It's just something to think about. And last but certainly not least, let's talk about the tank class. So tanks for me are some of the most important guys to have right from day 0 to 150. In that time period, your warband is at its weakest, and having a brother who is just tough, hard to hit and hard to kill is incredibly important, because you can use him to keep high damage and high threat enemies busy while the rest of your brothers go to work on all the other ones. Now, we have spoken a little bit about how a torturer can do much the same thing. The usefulness of a tank is that you are very often going to be getting brothers in the early game that have stars in melee defense. And even if they don't, as you can see here with this monk, it's very rare you can turn a monk into anything useful. The fact that he has iron lungs and you take shield expert gets his defense quite high. And having a monk who can actually hold a position on the front line rather than just sit in the back and have to get paid every day is quite useful. When it comes to a tank, you will find that you're going to have a brother like this who's not going to have very much in the way of melee skill. So in terms of weapon specializations, I recommend a spear if they're particularly dreadful like this. Or for someone like Torkel, who got up to 85, you could even have justified going up to sword mastery. The beauty of a tank is that you can have a formation like this, which allows you to be more heavy on the back line, on archers, shield breakers, pikemen. Because with the spear wall ability, they can shut down this whole area on the battlefield and hold down a flank. All too often you can find that if your flanks get compromised, you are in real trouble. Now, especially if you pair a spear wall using tank, a pikeman just behind him that has access to a war scythe, you will have the ability to keep enemies away, and those that do will get reaped and struck. Very, very effective. Typically, I would look to work my tank brothers out of rotation. And what I did was I got myself 2 of these Svihunda users. They're just greatsword using raiders. So for particular fights where you need more defense, you switch in the tanks. Other fights where you don't need the tanks, you just have them in reserve. Tanks, super useful. I think you are best off using them with heavy armor. You can technically make a light armor tank, but it's more difficult. You need someone with very high fatigue and very high initiative. You then have to take dodge and spot a relentless to keep their defense numbers up through having very high initiative. If you get a brother with iron lungs, multiple stars in fatigue and initiative, you have the best setup for someone to use sword mastery as a sword tank. With iron lungs, you will be recovering 19 fatigue per turn, and if you have sword mastery and you go into the riposte stance, that costs you 19 fatigue. So you can well imagine a brother with very high initiative, very high fatigue, getting upwards of 20 to 25 extra defense from dodge, together with 20 odd from heater shield, plus his innate, you can get up to 70, 80, even 90 melee defense. And he can remain fatigue neutral, just sitting in riposte, and he can tie up one whole side of the battlefield just riposting the hell out of people. Assuming, of course, he doesn't get hit with a mace, which will lower his fatigue. Tank, super. Okay, friends, I hope you found that useful. As always, if you need to take a look at my builds document, follow the link in the description to the Discord. There's a Stobbie's builds document pinned there. And if you enjoyed the content and hope you find some usefulness in it, please leave a like and subscribe. As always, I'm Stobbie149. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.